Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Dr. Devra Hock-Reid's talk tonight. Devra, among many other things, was a member of my staff back during COVID lockdowns while she was a PhD student at University of Nebraska-Lincoln and is now on the education team at the New Jersey State Museum, which is what we were kind of just chatting about before we got started here. Devra, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and you can expand on your background as well as this project you're going to tell us all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just recently got my PhD, and I also recently started my job as the assistant curator for science education at the New Jersey State Museum, which has given me a lot of opportunity to do some really cool science programming and science education. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. My research is mammalian paleoecology, so I come from that field, and so I take that kind of approach when thinking about certain programming. I also obviously come from an informal science, informal education background, working with David, and now at my job here. And so just combining the two is really an interesting thought. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. A lot of background and ideas around teaching, specifically climate change, in regards to how we can use paleontology and modern data and tools of teaching. And then I'll go into a little bit about how I'm developing and using that as well, but I try to keep it paleo-centric. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And again, feel free to have a conversation going in the chat. I can't necessarily see it when I'm screen sharing, but I will try and check it throughout. This idea about teaching about climate change, and in this case specifically sea level rise, as we'll get into, came about as I was looking at the museum's programming and what workshops we had and where we could go over the summer after having seen kind of what we had over the spring. I was in a good position to look at what we had with new eyes. And so we really don't have at my museum a workshop for school groups about climate change at all. We have a workshop that talks about different biomes throughout North America and how to use resources and be sustainable in biomes, but not about climate change specifically. And that's something that's being added in state standards for schools, and was really a gap that we were missing. So I took that opportunity to develop something. And so that's where this Changing Coastlines came in. We try and be fun with alliteration. And so that's where that's coming in. And so what I'm going to be focusing on today is the idea of teaching climate change through inquiry-based activities in informal education. And I'm going to start off by discussing some of the established difficulties that primarily elementary and middle school teachers have been known to have about teaching climate change. This has been stuff that's been in literature from studies. And so I'll be going over that, as well as some solutions and ideas of how to bridge that gap for the teachers or the general public, if you're looking at this more for a public programming idea. And then using the nature of science, talking about what that is, inquiry-based learning, why that's so applicable to science education, informal education in general, as well as climate change. And then incorporating paleo climate data with modern data and modern changes. And then by then we should have plenty of time left for some questions and answers and a fun discussion. So there are a few common themes of difficulties established by researchers that can essentially get split into two categories. gaps in knowledge about climate change and the politics surrounding climate change here in the States. And so these were gathered and we're going to talk about them in an effort to help people that might be talking about climate change in museums or in other informal settings, just so you know kind of what your audience might be coming into, might be coming in with, where you might need to meet them. It's always something that's really important to think about. So science education research has shown that for educators teaching about climate change, so these are people that are trained as teachers, but not necessarily trained as scientists, one of the biggest difficulties they face are gaps in their knowledge about the science behind climate change. And so thinking about what teachers and then the next step of general public does and doesn't know about climate change can provide us with a better starting point for education or outreach or both. So like I said, meeting them where they are is something that's really important. So the first, Earth's thermostat. Many people don't understand the difference between the ozone layer and the issues that we had previously with the ozone hole and the greenhouse effect. Those are something that get conflated, and they are similar issues, but they're not the same. And for a lot of people in their brains, they're the same issue. And so providing information regarding the ozone hole and greenhouse gases start to fill that gap. So explaining that the ozone hole was caused by very specific chemicals entering the Earth's atmosphere, that through legislation, we were able to limit the amount of those chemicals entering the atmosphere, and that the ozone hole has not really increased. It's not going to heal itself necessarily in our lifetimes, but it hasn't gotten bigger since legislation. But greenhouse gases, on the other hand, are gases that make up our atmosphere, but the ones that aren't playing nice right now are carbon dioxide and methane. And especially carbon dioxide with emissions, the more we put into the atmosphere, the more they are, and they can't leave the atmosphere. And then all of this stuff starts happening. So explaining the normal processes of infrared light leaving the atmosphere compared to when greenhouse gases block that and reflect it back down, creating that global thermostat, creating that global warming to cause essentially a positive feedback loop, can be very informative and can fill that gap of what is causing global warming, why that's happening, what's a normal process compared to what's going on now. So that's all stuff that does bridge that gap for why the Earth's temperature is what it is. The next one is past versus current climate change. And so this is where, as paleontologists, we can really use paleoclimate data to show past trends. But another important piece of the puzzle where people might not have the full grasp of the picture is the fact that climate scientists understand how our climate has changed in the past well enough to show that present climate change is anthropogenic. And so explaining what proxies are, because obviously we couldn't have weather stations or measure carbon dioxides at that moment thousands or millions of years ago. We have proxies that give us a really good hint of what those levels were. So explaining what the process of developing proxies are, showing the research, talking about what the past trends were is all really important stuff that helps show that what we're experiencing now is more based off of humans' impact on the Earth rather than just the natural cycles. And then indicators of climate change. Another knowledge gap to bridge is what we know now as indicators of climate changes. Most fundamentally, our climate's response to increased greenhouse gases, like I mentioned, is to warm. And so showing that different areas might have different temperatures, it's not warming equally, is all very important, as well as showing that warming really started after the Industrial Revolution with increased carbon dioxide. And so all of these things, they all go together, right? Rising temperatures then cause a decrease in land and sea ice, which can cause sea level rise. Rising temperatures can also cause more extreme weather. So this is a full system of, so talking about the climate system, how that relates to the hydrological system, the geological system, all of that stuff is important that we can pull from geology, paleontology, hydrology, where a lot of our backgrounds might be, as well as looking at longer patterns of temperature, carbon dioxide, like I mentioned before, to include patterns from paleoclimate data. And then future impacts. Another barrier that a lot of people have regarding climate change is understanding what the future may hold and how scientists make predictions. So explaining that scientists use models and simulations of our climate to forecast how it will respond to different changes in greenhouse gas emissions and how that might cause different temperature changes, etc. We have to be very careful with our language when we talk about modeling. We're not predicting the future, but this is a way that we can really pull away the curtain and really show the science behind climate science, and talk about what all goes into modeling and forecasting, the statistics, what data is needed, all of that stuff. And again, incorporating paleoclimate into discussions of modeling and modern and future climate forecasts can provide some insight about the type of data that's used, as well as provide validity to those forecasts. And then our probably favorite topic is politics. Another major boundary that a lot of people have when talking about climate change is the politicalization of it, especially in the States. Unfortunately, due to politics, it can be very difficult to teach or educate on the subject of climate change, whether that's for us as informal educators or museum staff developing exhibits, or teachers trying to communicate that in the classroom or doing informal trips to the museum. Politics and politicians have conflated this narrative, right? That scientists aren't in agreement about climate change, and especially aren't in agreement about the role humans have played in climate change. However, it's, I don't need to tell you that it's scientifically sound, right? But communicating that to the public is a tricky matter. We don't want to come across as condescending or talking down to them, but just explaining that it's been researched. Multiple, scientific communities have contributed to it. There's a lot of lines of evidence contributing to that. We know humans have caused the current climate change. And it's, on par with other scientific theories, like the theory of gravity. So explaining that robust evidence and support in the scientific community is important. And again, pulling in the paleontology community and the paleoclimate community in displaying this support of climate change is important. Incorporating past patterns in the paleontological and geological record can help show that evidence that the modern trends of today are not normal in Earth's history. Another downside of the current politicalization of climate change is that it's gotten likened to a faith-based system, right? We hear this a lot, is that, do you believe in climate change? It's like saying, do you believe in gravity? Like, it's a scientific established theory. But it encourages this idea that climate change is being debated, that it's something that if you don't believe in it, it's not real. So just focusing on scientific evidence and the process of that science is a good way to counteract such politics. A good thing, though, is that research has shown that youth tend to be more receptive to adults when learning about climate change. So if there's ways that you can target younger audiences in programming regarding climate change, it's been shown that they are more receptive to it. It's also been shown that when dealing with climate change, people need to know how it's going to affect them. So relating it to your local community is also a very important thing for a lot of different ways of science outreach and engagement, but specifically with climate change, which is where some of the meat of what I've developed comes in, is relating it to where I am in New Jersey. But climate change has impacted everywhere, so there's going to be ways that you can relate climate change to your community wherever you are. The other positive about that research is that when youth are taught about climate change in a scientific way, they are more likely to take that home and engage and educate their family about it, which can then lead to changing minds outside of your institution. So incorporating multi-generational programming as well as catering to the youth can be a really good way of instilling this idea of teaching about climate change. So with all of that out of the way, how do we teach about climate change? So I'm going to ask you to drop this in the chat, and I'll try and go back and find it when I'm done. What do you think of when you hear the word inquiry? So as I keep going, I'm going to take a moment, but then as I keep going as well, I just want you to drop in the chat what you think of when you hear the word inquiry. So we give everyone a few minutes or a few seconds. I gotta see the chat going. So as scientists, we are constantly involved in acts of inquiry, right? It's second nature to us. It's what guides our research, this idea of exploring the world. But for those that haven't done inquiry, it can be a lot harder to teach. So when you're dealing potentially with museum staff or educators who don't have a scientific background, if you are working with any programming directly with teachers, so being able to communicate what inquiry can be difficult. But the good thing is, as we know, inquiry doesn't have just one path. And especially when you're getting into inquiry-based learning, that especially doesn't have one path. The key to inquiry learning is putting learning in the hands of the learner. So student or visitor, whatever you want to do, whoever your audience is, putting the learning in the hands of them. So this falls under some constructivist theories that's prevalent in museum education, but I'm going to focus specifically on inquiry-based learning. But generally, this can look different in different programs or for different topics. But the most important component and the part that makes any activity an inquiry-based activity is allowing learners to truly engage with the ideas you want them to engage with by generating ideas of their own and then finding answers on their own. So inquiry-based learning mimics how we approach science. And I'll get into that with nature of science in a second. But an overarching principle of don't give the answer in advance can be used. So this would be really more applicable to education programming, where you might be developing a workshop like I did here, or working with teachers to develop handouts or tours or something like that. But inquiry learning allows learners to develop foundational understanding of scientific content and deepens their understanding of how to do science and what science is. So even if we're not dealing with youth, or we're not dealing with students in elementary school or middle school or high school or college, having a public that knows how to do science and knows what science is creates a generation of educated, science-aware people, which is important, right? So all of that stuff is very important. And one way of doing that is using or generating data. And so sometimes that doesn't always happen, especially like in a drop-in program or something like that. But allowing learners to generate their own data, or at the very least interact with data on their own, are key components of inquiry. So, as we probably all know, the scientific method as we were taught, right, in school, is not what we do in our daily lives. The scientific method that we are probably all taught was very linear and straightforward, right? Observation, hypothesis, experiment, and analysis, conclusion. Most of us, I'm sure, don't follow a linear method to how we approach our research. So why should we perpetuate this idea that there is one scientific method for all fields of science, whether we're doing that through our exhibits, through talks, through outreach, etc.? Instead, scientific inquiry and the process of science should be taught. It's not linear at all. Not all science, as we know, requires an experiment, as we were, taught in middle school and high school chemistry and biology. Rather, how we explore ideas and engage with data is how we work as scientists. And so bringing that in to exhibits, to programming, to your museum as a whole is really important, showing the nature of science. And so the nature of science is what it sounds like. It's a way of teaching the full process of science rather than just the results or the facts. So especially in museums, we're very fond of putting results or commonly held, long-held ideas, the status of the field. We're very fond of labels in exhibits, and labels are static. So at some point you have to make a decision about what's going on there. But science is not static, right? Science continues to move and change and evolve. So almost as soon as your exhibit is installed, parts of it are probably out of date. I remember this doesn't have to do with science, but last year, a year and a half ago, I went to the Ruth Bader Ginsburg exhibit at the Holocaust Museum in Houston. And it wasn't that old of an exhibit. It was touring. But there was a panel that was out of date because it said that there had never been an African-American Supreme Court justice. And I went there right after our recent Supreme Court justice, who's an African-American woman, was put on the bench. And I'm like, that's out of date now. But for that exhibit company to go in, take the glass off that table and replace the label is actually a lot of work. And so there's a balance of telling people what established facts are in the field and leaving room for showing how science or non-science fields advance. One way of doing that is talking about the people behind it, the collaboration, new findings and changes in the field, those that can also get out of date rather quickly. But ultimately, the nature of science and inquiry learning really go hand in hand. And there's been a lot of research that talks about the benefits of moving away from a transmission model of learning or of teaching. And so this idea that the expert, be it a curator, a teacher stands at the front of the room and tells the learners what to learn, and they sit there and passively learn it. That is not the best way to teach, especially science. Most people don't learn passively. They learn by doing. And so incorporating that into your programming or into your exhibit is a really good way of enabling that people understand what the full nature of science is. And this gets then into scaffolding in the zone of proximal development. This is more a little bit for when you're doing actual workshops rather than exhibits, but you can still apply some of this to exhibits or general programming as well. Part of what makes using inquiry-based learning so hard is that students or learners have to generate the knowledge themselves. And that's not easy to do, right? Even for us trained scientists, it's hard to generate new knowledge. So most of the time, we have to help out learners and give them clues and hints of what the information they need. So this approach is called the zone of proximal development. And so it's essentially this idea that there are things on the graphic, it says child, but there are things a learner can do without any assistance or understand without any assistance. And there are things that a learner can do or understand or can't do or understand, even with assistance. You want to be somewhere in the middle. So you want to challenge learners to think outside their comfort zone, to keep moving, keep progressing what they know. But you're going to give them some assistance to do that, be it through a program, a guided tour, exhibit labels, interactives in a gallery. This can come in a lot of different ways, but the key is that you're giving them some hints along the way to help them get to a stage where they can do or learn the new information that you're giving them. Ultimately, it's been shown in some research that learners and students that experience inquiry learning are more likely to correct past knowledge that might not be 100% correct, and they can modify that with the new information that they're given. On the flip side, when people think of science as a collection of facts and think of explanations as reports of unconnected events, there's less of a likelihood that their ideas will be changed even with new information. And that's something we don't want, right? We want to see visitors and learners and students grow and develop their ideas with new information and keep continuing their ideas. So we really want to get across that science isn't static and that it's okay for it to change and grow and evolve. Also, inquiry learning does work well with groups, and social interactions have been shown to mediate learning. This is really evident in museums, be it just a family group in an exhibit or table activities or workshops, programming, etc. But putting learning in the hands of a group of people where they can take control has been shown to be the most effective. And ultimately, inquiry-based learning, teaching about science as a process, is a way of teaching learners, visitors, the public, how to think critically about the world around them. And like I said, that just creates an entire public, an entire generation of people who can think critically, who understand science, and why wouldn't we want that? So now I'm going to go into some ways that we can use paleo and modern data and talk a little bit more about the workshop that I've developed using some of these concepts. So when teaching about climate change, as I've mentioned, it's important to work with students or visitors to break down and explain what climate and what climate change is. So in my workshop, I go over what weather is, I go over what climate is, and work with the students to explain and discuss that climate is the long-term patterns of the atmosphere, essentially the average of weather over time and space. I also go over how climate scientists create baselines for comparison using averages over 10 or 20 or 30 years of weather data, and then compare patterns to that baseline to see if there's a significant or substantial change from the average. And so, as I mentioned earlier, inquiry-based learning is most successful when learners can interact with scientific data to generate their own questions and answers. And to that point, one option is to introduce learners to paleoclimate data. Depending on your focus of topic, you can use any source of paleoclimate data. For me, talking about global temperature changes and sea level rise, the past data that I would use would be glacial extents, because that ties in with a lot of different cycles, a lot of different systems. But you can use geological changes, you can use all sorts of paleoclimate data or paleontology or geology data to introduce and let your students or learners or visitors engage with data and get some of those ideas that we talked about in their own brains and in their hands to experience it. The other way is to use modern data or more recent data. And so using more recent data that climate scientists might use or have used can also teach learners how to establish baselines and patterns of change. And so for the workshop I've developed, the first half is talking about global temperatures. And so I'm giving them these plots and 4 others before this to go back to 1900 and give them a chart. And I have them plot the data that's basically within that star, which represents roughly where New Jersey is, right? Connecting it to what they think is important. And I have them graph global temperatures in one location, essentially across a decade. And then we discuss what the trends are, what we see change from an average, and where the trends start. So with this, we would really start to see an increase in global temperatures roughly around 1980. That corresponds to a lot more greenhouse gas emissions. Other stuff has been shown to really start around the 70s and the 80s as well in terms of climate change. The other part of my workshop, which I didn't provide a slide or a graphic for because there's really not one, is a lot more heavily inquiry based. So this would be considered guided inquiry, where they're given the scientific data and they're asked to manipulate it or use it, but they aren't generating the questions themselves, right? I'm asking them to plot the points and then they can discuss the trends that they see. The second part is I give them geological maps of New Jersey, especially on the coasts. I give them census data of where people live, and I give them forecasts of sea level rise. And then I have them work as groups to act as though they were state planners for sea level rise. And I let them go. So this is something that's catered for 6th grade and above. Inquiry is really hard to do with younger kids. You really have to guide them more. But I let them act as though they are city or state planners. And they are free to do whatever they want within reason. But I prompt them to think about what their issues might come up, where they might see problems. So because of sea level rise and census data, there's a lot of population on the coasts, what issues that might bring up. If they need other data that I didn't give them, what questions they might have, what answers they can answer, what answers they might not be able to generate. So that is pretty much a fully hands-off of an instructor side inquiry-based activity. Something like that is much more of a workshop, hands-on teaching type of activity. But there are ways that you can incorporate an inquiry activity along the lines of that in a science center and in a museum and an exhibit. There's a lot of use of technology. Those tabletops are really fun to explore different options of a lot of simulations. And so if I was to put this type of activity in a gallery as an interactive, that's what I would pursue, is a screen-based simulation where they can control variables and look at causes and impacts that way. And so that's kind of what I have prepared. At this point, I'm going to open it up to questions and or discussions. I'm going to have the chat open. So if you have a question that you want to drop in the chat, feel free to, and I will see it and answer it. If you want to unmute yourself to ask a question, that is also great, but remember to keep your video off, and I'm going to keep the slide up as well so that if someone's video is on, there's only a small box of you rather than a full screen. But with that, that's kind of what I have prepared about using data for inquiry-based learning about climate change, and I'd love to chat for the next however long we have till the top of the hour, roughly. Alrighty, so Kenshu in the chat asked, do you think one challenge to convince the public, especially adults, that climate change is real is because the concept is too often framed in terms of a belief system? This is certainly a problem when teaching the concept of evolution, and I feel there are too many people out there who think science to be also a faith-based practice. How do you think we can break this erroneous preconceived notion? So, yes, short answer. A lot of people think that, and I don't know if it's just because it's easier to think that it's faith-based than just to put the fact that people came up with these ideas or people recorded these, results. But it is too often framed in terms of a belief system. Like I mentioned, I do think that's in part due to the politicalization of it. Especially in America, there's been a pretty robust anti-science effort by a certain political party. And I do think this is an outcome of that, is equating science to religion. You can be both. You can be religious and be a scientist, but they are different. It is definitely a problem when teaching about evolution, right? So you have to contend with creationists and stuff like that. Ultimately, there's not one answer I can give about how we can break this preconceived notion. A lot of people have an issue or have a problem with changing their inherent belief system or how their mind works. And so all we can do as institutions of science is to present the science in ways that they can maybe slip it in. This is more easy with evolution than with climate change. But ultimately it's up to them to deal with cognitive dissonance and all that goes into conflating faith and science and stuff like that, and bringing in misconceptions and preconceived notions. It's really hard to break preconceived notions because that's essentially your worldview. So for me, being upfront and presenting the science behind it, having a frank conversation with them goes a long way. It shows them that scientists are human. And I think this is where using the nature of science and the process of science is a good introduction to show them how science works rather than just giving them an answer. So hopefully I gave you some things to start thinking about. Okay. Rebecca said, do you have any links to data sets I'm willing to share that are accessible to a general audience for these types of inquiry-based activities? So I just gave a similar talk on this or from this to teachers last week at a teachers conference. And I do have a Google Classroom that I put together for the teachers that gave them a lot of resources and references about what I talked about. I don't have links to a lot of databases. There are some simulations out there that can be good. Colorado FET has a lot of simulations. They have a good greenhouse gas one. NASA and NOAA have some sea level rise simulations and stuff like that. I don't have those links off the top of my head. I can always send them to David and he can distribute them maybe. But ultimately, I think compiling scientific data, so like from either government agencies or papers or where we would get databases for our research, and then using that and simplifying it down to a way that you can give it to non-scientific learners is ultimately the best way. So it does sometimes take a bit of work to get to that point. But it would be great for more databases of those finished projects and those finished data to be available. So not everybody has to go through the work of that process of simplifying scientific data down. But off the top of my head, I don't know of a lot of databases that can just be given to a general audience without some work on the educator or on our end. There are some, like I said, simulations that are good on that. But that's all about I can think of off the top of my head.
I wanted to jump in real quick and mention something. So we're already kind of looking at how we can do this virtual meeting better next year for folks across SVP membership. If something like having a symposium where there's a bunch of presentations where people talk about data sets or activities like the ones Devra has been describing, we can do that. We have an incredible amount of flexibility in what the SVP leadership is kind of letting us do for this virtual meeting. So if there's an interest in doing that, talk to each other and then come talk to me and we can try to make it happen. It's one of the brilliant things about virtual is that we're not beholden to conference center rooms and all these other constraints that you have for the in-person meeting. So keep these ideas going and let me know if it's something you want to pursue seriously, and we can definitely talk about it. Devra, I'll toss one in while we're waiting. Other folks are going to type something. So if you got, let's say that you got some kind of big influx in funding, we'll ballpark it and say $10,000. I'm going to assume that's a good chunk of money for your program. What changes do you think you could make? Basically, if you just had like a resource injection, what would be your priorities for this kind of work?
For like climate change research or education is education in general in a museum?
Well, for this kind of work that you're doing, and maybe in your community, maybe more broadly, like in the region, like what would your pathway to greatest impact be?
I would say like a more tech-based simulation. So physical maps and data are great. And I think it is important for kids to learn hands-on with non-technology, but there's so much more you can do in a simulation. And it can reach a broader audience because it's not restrained to the classroom or to a workshop room. So something I struggled with as I was developing this was like, especially the second activity was, how do I teach that and keep it within inquiry? And I do have a contour map, a contour topographic model. Some of you might have seen these in like Geology 101 classrooms, where you add water and it can, see the rise of the water against a mountain. So I'll be using that to demonstrate sea level rise as well. But like the NOAA simulator or a custom built simulator that's specific to New Jersey, I think that would be something that's really useful, because then they can control a lot of variables. They can control the amount of sea level rise. They can control other variables that impact sea level rise, like temperature. Something that I talk about in the workshop is the reason temperature and sea level rise is connected is because water expands when it's hot. So it's not just that we're losing the glaciers and we're losing the ice caps, and that's introducing more water to the system. The water that's in the oceans now is just simply expanding because it's hotter. And so controlling those variables and being able to play around with it for more greenhouse gas, climate change in general, there's so many variables that go into what we're seeing and what we're forecasting that we see. And being able to see, like, oh, if I lower emissions, what does that do? If I increase emissions or keep them the same, what does that do? Stuff like that. So that would have a larger reaching impact, because it could be a simulation that's available online. It could be something that's done in a classroom, something that's done on a tabletop in a gallery. So I would say something like that, where they can really just explore the concept and see immediately what variables link together. It'd probably be more than $10,000, but if we're assuming a, imaginary budget. But overall, I think whether it's workshops like this one or programming, developing guides that teachers can use in their own classroom, climate change is being introduced in science standards. And so a lot of teachers are looking for ways to teach that and curriculum with that. And so as museums, letting teachers use us as a resource, I think, is a really powerful way of maintaining local engagement and community with our local schools, whether they come to us or we do a Zoom to them, or we give them, physical resources. Like I just did with the professional development, giving them digital resources. The museums are looked at as institutions of knowledge. And so fulfilling that essentially to the teachers and giving them resources, I think, is a really important way and an important tool in how we can maintain connections and grow in connections and engagement in our community.
I'll point out real quick that there is and I think this is relevant to some of the stuff that Devra's been talking about, although it's older. There is another virtual world connected to the museum, and if you go explore it, you can find a little portal to a recreation of the Permian Karoo in South Africa, which Devra helped make as one of my virtual camp instructors way back in 2021. And there's a lot of the concepts and she's been talking about are in kind of, I don't know, slightly embryonic form represented there, but she had a pretty big hand in constructing that, and if you have a chance to go poke around it, I definitely recommend it.
Yeah, that one's fun if you like old school 8-bit Mario games or Zelda games. You will have fun with that. We did have to lock the students out, like they would have kept playing or exploring, so you should have fun with that one. Right,
Mike? I see you there. One of the students from that camp is in the audience right now.
It's good to see you again. I'm glad that you're here.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, you had to lock us out. We would have kept going.
Stop mapping. You
yeah,
need to
go
to
see
bed.
your family. Yeah, exactly. Explore the summer.
Mapping too many rocks.
Yeah.
No such thing.
Well, I think we're, pretty much at time.
Yeah, we can wrap it up. And we've got another event starting in 7 minutes, I believe. It is our colonialism in vertebrate paleontology discussion panel. So I definitely recommend folks hop over to that. And then after that one, we'll be seeing Devra again this evening in the Academia Exit, the panel discussion about turning your academic training into other career fields. And we've got a really great group of folks on that one as well. So definitely recommend if folks have time, they pop into that. And then film historian Charles Solomon will be jumping in later on at 9 o'clock Central Time tonight. And we owe Stuart Sumida, our SVP Vice President, for that one, for recruiting Charles to come and talk with us this evening.
Excellent. Well, yeah, hope to see some of you at the panel later. And
all right, I'm going to end this. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Devra, for giving us some of your time this evening to chat about your work.
absolutely.
All right, take care, everyone.